And it turns out that a lot of those things that are good processes for development turn out to be real handy for security as well, right? Like mandating documentation, like putting everything into a marketplace or into a gateway, right? That actually all helps security as well.
I'm Jason Harmon, and this is API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. Welcome back to API Intersection. As always, I'm your host, Jason Harmon, CTO at Stoplight. It's been a bit since we've talked about kind of security stuff in APIs, and it's certainly a timely subject as we see the numbers coming in that these things are on the rise. APIs are everywhere now. It's in everything. You're surrounded by them as we speak, and they're all being hacked apparently. So I'm glad that we found a guest who certainly this is his wheelhouse, and I want to thank Dan Barahona for joining us. Dan, did I say your name right? I forgot to ask before.
You did a great job. Not the easiest last name to nail. Probably the first Barahona you've met, but no.
Indeed.
Super pleased to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dan's coming to us from APIsec and a little APIsec University thing that's we're going to tell you more about. But tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what got you here.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been around cybersecurity for a good long while, 20 plus years or so. Lots of different stops along the way. ArcSight, Anomaly, Qualys. I'm at a company called APIsec now. And last year got involved with creating APIsec University, which has been a really remarkable journey and a whole lot of fun just to try to build some awareness and education around API risks and how to go about securing APIs. It's been really well received by the community.
Yeah, as I said, I think with the things we all keep reading about and that I'm sure plenty of the practitioners listening have been dealing with is this is the new attack surface. So I think timely to provide educational material. I did a little dabbling on it myself this morning, and it's pretty cool. Seems like, what is it, Corey Ball, I think his name is, that's doing those?
Yeah, I've got to make a little plug here for my good friend, Corey. He's the author of this book, Hacking APIs, which has been really sort of, shaking the market on what these risks are and how prevalent they are. I mean, you've probably seen the stat that Gartner's been saying, for years now that APIs would become the most frequent attack vector. Something like 80+% of the internet is API traffic these days. Like you said, it's all around us. And of course, the attackers have taken notice. And what's sort of interesting is, APIs provide so much good capability, integration and scalability and being able to create applications that are incredibly functional. And APIs expose all that wonderful functionality, but they also expose all the warts. And if there are any flaws or vulnerabilities or logic gaps in your APIs and your applications, actually, those get exposed too. And those are the things that turn into great big breaches. And geez, there are tons of them out there, plenty of examples.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think, I surmise that many of the listeners are dealing with this challenge of none of us want to get our APIs hacked. And certainly some of their, security colleagues don't either. But I feel like we're still in a very weird disconnect. This is a space I follow really closely. It's obviously a subject I care about. I've done a lot with kind of identity and auth systems. And it just, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like anything's clicking yet. It's like I see the attacks on the rise, the problems, everyone wants to learn about it, talk about it. But I feel like within organizations, there's still something broken. I'm curious, what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing that. Something's not clicking, right? For the amount of like high profile breaches that are happening, that are in the news, that are clearly related to APIs. I mean, just this week we got Reddit, right? And what is it, 80 gigs of data stolen that's now being ransomed back to Reddit. And there's so many other examples. I'm sure by tomorrow there'll be another one. And yet, the adoption of API security programs and technologies seems to be lacking, or it's lagging. Maybe is the word, right? And what's interesting is the conversations that we've had really are pretty eye opening. When we talk to security teams, there's almost like a deer in the headlights look about APIs. Like, yeah, we know they're a thing, we know they're a risk. But we don't know a whole lot about them. We don't even know all the APIs we got. We need to go out and discover these APIs. And even the word discover sounds like it's a mystery. We got to go, find a treasure map and figure out where these APIs are. And then when you go talk to product teams, that's not their worry, right? They're worried about security. That is for sure, right? This notion that engineering doesn't care about security, I don't buy that, honestly. Yeah. But this notion that we don't know our APIs is garbage, honestly. And when you talk to product teams, they want to have an inventory of APIs just like security does. But the way they go about it is, let's just go talk to all the product owners and let's go talk to the different teams. And if you don't get the vast majority of your APIs that way, then something's really out of whack. And this kind of concept of rogue and shadow APIs, to me, that reeks of, you got a governance problem. Like, how is that happening? How is it that you're not controlling what's being put onto the network? It's
all over right now, though. I think, and I certainly, with the Stoplight viewpoint, get a probably unique look at it. But the realities of API sprawl are like ever present. I mean, everywhere you turn, at least for us, everywhere we look, it's like people kind of going, we tried to be cool and build lots of APIs because they're good, but we didn't keep track of them all. And now they're just out there and we don't even know what we have anymore.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of like building the catalog is definitely where a lot of folks are at right now. And to your point, it is a governance function. I think what's weird is, how many times it's like, let's just analyze logs to find them, which I always find strange and counterintuitive, but I guess design first mindset, right? That's like, find the contracts, but they don't exist. Anyways, go ahead.
Well, it's the security playbook, right? Let's put a video camera on it. Let's put some algorithms on it. Let's go detect these things. And there's nothing wrong with that approach, but you're probably going to spend a lot of time censoring your network to try to get all the traffic, visible. And, it's going to see what it sees, right? If that API is not being exercised or an endpoint's not being exercised, you're not going to see it. Or if you're not putting a sensor on that segment of the network, you're not going to see it. And so, we put a whole lot of effort into finding these things. But I think, yes, there's a ton of sprawl. And you're right. Like, we went off and went crazy with developing APIs. And there's probably a retrenching needed, which to say, like, let's rationalize all this stuff, right? And I've talked to companies who are like, okay, we've got 500 APIs. We need to get it down to like 100, right? And so they recognize there's been this sprawl and probably a bunch of stuff that doesn't need to be out there, or maybe it's out of date, or it just hasn't been touched in a while. So let's get that under control. And you talk about like marketplaces and that sort of thing. Like, I think it was really interesting. I was talking to the guys from Kroger, and some really clever guys. They were presenting at the Appy Days conference, and what they did was they wanted to build an inventory of all their APIs, and they went to Confluence and things like that. But then they just walked around and talked to everybody, and eventually got a pretty good thing. But then what they did was interesting. They wanted to create a kind of a process and a program that benefited the developers and the API product owners, and they created a marketplace, an internal marketplace. So if you got an API, then here's where you can showcase it and make it accessible and let people discover it, right? And so it turned out to be something as a net positive to the development organization, while also being better governance, better security, better standardization and process flow. So that was a really interesting approach, I thought, that they'd taken.
It's one thing we hear a lot from kind of smart practitioners is like, you can sort of build the program. And if you go at it with this sort of enforcement mindset, it's like, try to tell a group of developers what to do. You're going to get the opposite. Right? But more exactly. So is like, let me explain what happens if you don't use these things we're offering, right? Here's the risks that you're taking on by yourself. If you use the stuff that we're providing, in terms of sort of governance rule sets or even toolkits, whatever, then, your APIs are going to look cool. They're not going to look like a one-off that you made up. They're going to look like everything else. And the carrot of, we're going to protect you from all these risks, right? So I think that kind of enablement mindset is definitely what works these days, especially with, I think, developers coming up who it's like, man, you really can't tell them what to do. But anyway, CTO trauma, sorry.
Yeah, there you go. Well, and it turns out that a lot of those things that are good processes for development turn out to be real handy for security as well, right? Like mandating documentation, like putting everything into a marketplace or into a gateway, right? That actually all helps security as well, right? Because if you really want to test your APIs or find vulnerabilities or things like that, the first place any team's going to want to go to is the documentation. Like, what does this API do? What are all the endpoints? What does the authentication look like? How are the payloads defined? What kind of data does it have access to? And if you don't have that defined somewhere, you're just making security's job a whole lot harder.
Yeah. I guess back to, I don't know, we kind of rabbit trailed there, but this is a huge topic, so it's fair. I guess on the subject of kind of security teams maybe being a little out of touch, it's like, I guess in my mind, it wasn't that long ago that most security teams were just focused on network boundaries, and that was it, right? That was like, I think less than 10 years ago for the most part. And in some places, it's probably still that way. And then it's like, oh, what about cloud? And like, do we have access control stuff right? And I feel like in some ways, this has all been too fast for security teams. And ultimately, they don't have a lot of application developers to understand some of this stuff. So I guess,
that's right.
I'm curious from your perspective, like, how do we cross the bridge? How do we get there and not have APIs be the world's next big problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so having lived through a lot of this cybersecurity, evolution for the last 20 years, you're spot on, right? I come from the SIEM world, and back in the day, logs were, firewall logs and network logs. That's what you looked at, right? And then, now we're like, now we have web application firewalls, things that are app savvy. And now we have API savvy, network-based technologies and things like that. And, what's interesting is, what sort of skills are needed to really tackle security at this level. It's no longer, looking for port scanning and really basic signature kind of stuff. Like, you've got to go deep into the logic layer of applications, and when we look at sort of state of the art of API testing or app testing in general, you've got things. I mean, yes, you've got static code analyzers and dynamic testers and that sort of thing that tend to look at injections and cross-site scripting and still kind of like pretty plain vanilla type of threats. But when you look at the breaches that happen in the real world, they tend to be logic breaches, right? There's some sort of logic flaw, right? It's like if you take Coinbase, for example, like what happened there was this person reverse engineered the API calls for selling some crypto. And then instead of using the UI, use the API to issue direct calls to the back end. And literally he had an account with like Ethereum. And he said, okay, these 50 units of Ethereum aren't Ethereum, they're Bitcoin. And just change what they were in an API call. And he literally was expecting an error code. He just wanted to see what the error looked like. And instead he got a $240,000 just got deposited into his account. And that is a logic flaw, right? And I don't know any inline tool that can detect that, right? Because it's too nuanced. There's not enough context. So the state of the art or the approach is to pressure test the hell out of your APIs. And that typically is the domain of like a red team or a pen tester. And typically that's been like pen testing a mobile app or a web app, right? There's structure in a UI. You can do this, you can't do that. But if you want to pen test an API, like there's no structure at all, right? You're looking at a flashing cursor prompt and you got to write code if you want to do it. So you got to be security savvy, you got to be application savvy, you got to be API savvy, right? It's a bunch of skills that are really tricky to combine, and it's one of the reasons why we created APIsec University. So there's my little plug. It's a site that's got a bunch of really awesome free non-vendory courses. So highly recommend people check it out. But those logic flaws are the Achilles heel of APIs, right? And so I think the only way you can really truly find them is through really comprehensive, continuous, aggressive testing, attack simulating, and just try every combination, every permutation of request and see what works.
See, it's interesting. We've shared quite a bit on kind of coming out of the podcast on what API product managers should be doing. And like one of the high points was, this is not like your point and click user experience where testing is going to be hard to implement. You have no excuse for not testing all those permutations. This is a programmatic interface you're designing, right?
That's right.
But it occurs to me as you're saying all this that I guess that means that product managers need to talk to security teams. How much does that happen in real life?
Yeah. It needs to happen a whole lot more. I was actually just talking to a big healthcare company that are embarking on an API security program. So this is a security team. And the guy that's running this is just kind of ramping up, looking for advice everywhere he could. And my number one piece of advice was go and talk to the product team. Go and talk to the engineering team. Like, this is not going to work well if you're not having a tight collaboration with them. And this whole concept of shifting left, I mean, it's almost it's unoptional. It's not optional here, right? Because where's the fix? Like, let's say you find a vulnerability, some flaw in that API that makes you vulnerable. It's not a firewall rule that you're going to go right. It's probably code that needs to get added into the application itself. Mm-hmm. It's code that's got to go fix like that Coinbase, gap, right? And Coinbase, in full fairness, like they did a great job of acknowledging what happened. They fixed it within a day, and they blogged about it. And they said the cause of the issue was a missing logic validation check. That's a direct quote, right? So security teams have to be talking to the product teams, right? And that has to be a collaboration that probably hasn't really existed anywhere near where it's going to need to be going forward.
Yeah, well said. I guess when you're looking at, we're kind of poking here at what is it that needs to change to make things better. But I guess when you're, engaging with your customers or just kind of, getting to know folks, like what's kind of the advice that you tend to give on things that they should be looking for, like kind of, categories of concern here on how to set up an API-centric security program? Yeah.
Well, not to be too self-serving, but we do have a course called API Security Fundamentals on the site, and it's a 90-minute course, and it's really kind of was built to address that one question. In fact, a lot of companies now are making that course mandatory, and they've even asked that they be able to deploy the course in their internal systems, which we do actually offer that. But what we cover in there are, we talk about real world breaches. We talk about the OWASP top 10. But the thing I kind of want to zero in on here is what we think of as the 3 pillars of API security. And those 3 pillars are governance, testing, and monitoring. And that seems to really cover, in a small number of categories, the real spectrum of what you need to be thinking about from an API security perspective. So the governance side is really where you ought to be starting, right? And that's about how do we securely develop and deploy and operate our APIs. And it's things like what you guys do at Stoplight, right? Like having well-defined documentation, setting standards for like versioning. When do we version? When do we retire? What are our authentication policies? What's the minimum?
That's the bit, is like, make sure you actually have auth defined in your open API. Jeez, come on, people, like, you'd be shocked.
Well, and then I've seen some really good style guides out there where they're like, I think it's Atlassian, they say, okay, authentication at minimum, you need username, password. If there's PII, then you need to have, a higher level. And then it states like authorization, not handled by the API. It's an application duty, right? So that's what, governance is all about, right? Like, putting all this stuff into a marketplace or into a gateway and having, standard processes for deploying it. Then we got the testing pillar, right? Which is, really, like you said, this is a programmatic interface. And there's no reason why, if we're unit testing and we're performance testing and we're scalability testing, why aren't we security testing in the CI/CD pipeline? Right? There's no excuse for that, right? Why are you waiting for the twice a year pen test?
See, but I think it's interesting that you pointed out that example earlier of the kind of Coinbase hack. Is like, I think sometimes people look at like, well, we defined all our auth stuff, so we're good. But in a mature security viewpoint, you're looking really at things as risk management. And to your point, like managing your currency and not having like currency conversion holes, that's a big risk if your job is to manage money stuff, right? So it has to, I like the perspective you're bringing, that manage the risks, which potentially include the auth stuff, but it's probably a whole lot of other things too.
Well, and one of the symptoms there is, we see this a lot in the real world breaches, is an over-reliance on the UI as a security enforcer, right? And we did a webinar recently with this guy, Sam Curry, who hacked like almost every car you can think. It's really remarkable. And I mean, literally through the API, start and stop engine, unlock doors, account takeover, locate the vehicle, all of that, right? And it's the same thing almost every time, right? They go to a mobile app or a web app, do some things, sniff the API traffic, then call the API direct. And when you call the API direct, a lot of those controls are gone, right? Like that Coinbase example, you could never have changed Ethereum to Bitcoin in the UI. There's no button for that, right? The UI controls what you can do, but an API is a wide open field. And so that's why I like this style guide from Atlassian. It said authorization is an application level duty, not the UI. It's not a credentialing issue. You've got to control it at the app logic level. So yeah,
I think there's another point in there that you're kind of making that is something I've certainly beat people over the head with for years. Is like, we'll talk about sort of API visibility. I go, well, this one is just for our own apps. It's not public. I go, but wait, is it over the internet without any VPN or anything? Yeah, well, then it's public. It's just a matter of time before someone's going to sniff that traffic, dig into your app, whatever, and figure out how it works. My favorite, which now is like an antique example, was when Teslas first came out and they had, the sort of API controllable things in the car, and someone figured out that they had used a get to toggle opening the door. Well, that's great, except if you end up behind some sort of caching proxy that caches that get and your doors just stick open. But that was not surfaced by Tesla or anyone else. It was that somebody went and documented Tesla's API in a GitHub repo and then showed this example, right? They never wanted that out there. Then I'm sure their folks are thinking like, well, we didn't say that that's available, but it is, right? So if you put it on the internet, it's public. Treat it as such, right?
Absolutely. We have a lot of best practices in the course, and one of them is like, don't have hidden APIs. Like, they are not hidden; they will be discovered. Don't have undocumented APIs. If you're going to put it out there, then like expect it to be discovered. Make sure you know what you're putting out there.
But I think
and
it's that fallacy in thinking that leads to people going, well, it's protected because the only thing that we've documented is the UX for it. Right? It's like, like just the little Chrome inspector is going to show the traffic. It's not hard to figure out, right?
It's not. I've actually talked to, ironically, security companies where they make their APIs available if you want to download all your data or results or scans or whatever it is, right? And they have this one particular company. They said, yeah, we have our documented APIs, and then we have a bunch of APIs that our UI uses them, and this and that. And we know that people are going to go reverse engineer, and that's, they're sort of okay with it. It's like, okay, that's just that's not a good policy. That's not a good way to behave. But for sure, especially in the hacking cars, there's so many examples of APIs that were never meant to get utilized, that this guy found and was able to very cleverly manipulate. There was one example where he found an internal single sign-on page for employees, and he was able to hack into it. He just created like a basic account, and then he looked at the API traffic, and there was a parameter which was like user type. So he just guessed, and he said user type equals dealer, right? And it worked. And suddenly he had access to the dealer portal, right? And he could see every vehicle they'd sold, the inventory, you name it. So yeah, you're right though. Like there's no notion of security from it's an internal. Don't think like that.
Yeah. So let's see, I kind of derailed you there. You were on sort of testing, and then I guess monitoring was the third one, right?
And then, the third pillar, monitoring. I mean, that's critical, right? You got to monitor. There's some things that, like testing, will reveal if you've got, rate limit controls or things like that. But, you want to be doing monitoring. If you want to look for brute force attacks, you want to look for high volume types things. You want to do, there's a lot of things like gateways can do, right? You can, set IP whitelisting. If you want to make sure this API is only accessible to trusted partners, right? Doing things like cores, right? Like, cross-origin resource sharing. Like, make sure that your APIs can't be exercised by entities that you don't allow. So there's plenty of need for monitoring, whether it's security monitoring or monitoring in a gateway. But those are the three pillars, right? Governance, testing, and monitoring. And that's where, that's sort of the core advice, is to really be thinking about those three elements, and start on the governance side and work your way to the right. Do testing, pre-production, automate it as much as you can, shift it left.
Pre-production's better than production testing. I agree.
Yeah, you could test in production as a validation. That's nice. Make sure things didn't change. But yeah, find the issues before they ever go live. Do it continuous, right? Like not once or twice a year, but on every release. So wire it right in, and do the monitoring, right? The blocking and tackling to make sure nothing weird's happening that you need to know about.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think. Especially on like the pen testing stuff, it's like the old model of twice a year we hire someone to go run a script pack against us, and that's that. Like, it ain't enough anymore. You got to have something that's CI/CD integrated as much as you can. Hard to afford these things sometimes. I know certainly for us as a small company, it's it limits what you can do. But
well, the good thing about automation is you're not paying like for bodies to be, sitting down, dreaming up attack scenarios. That's the scale problem, right? Like, relying on pen tests, like it's time consuming, it's manual, and APIs are hard to test, right? Yeah. It's not a human interface, it's a machine interface, and you're employing humans to try to do it.
Yeah, it's another interesting factor though of pen tests for me. It's funny because I don't talk about a lot of security stuff on the show here, but like it's part of my job at Stoplight is heading our security program, and it's a lonely job, but I think about it a lot. It's like pen testing. I feel like in so many cases, and I don't mean to kind of knock down our vendors here, but it's like I feel like they're just like a standard web app script pack that they all run. And it doesn't, like, the APIs are just an invisible surface on that. And it seems rare that they find anything on those things. And but I think back to like when I took years ago, like my first like GAC course, and it was like, I was kind of like like here's the pack of tools that hackers usually use. We're going to learn how to use them and run this stuff. And so it really is just run the script pack, right? Like this is the things most people use. So like, is there kind of that script pack out there for APIs now? Like, I don't know. I haven't really.
Yeah. Yes and no. Yes and no. Right. Like the script pack would look like, and there are tools out there that do like the web scanners out there, right? They're gonna throw a bunch of, injections into your input parameters and fuzzing, and
which is still the top exploit, right? Like,
yeah, no, it's like that's like, shame on you if you get it breached from an injection. Like that's a detectable thing, like there's no excuse for that. Now the scanners need to be API savvy, right? So they need to be able to read a Swagger file and know what your endpoints look like and that kind of thing. So yeah, right. That's kind of the next generation, and the tools are coming out that do that. But let's be real though, like, if you take the Coinbase example, there's no pack for that, right? Like there's some, there's some sophistication of testing that needs to happen, right? And I think where things are weakest is on authorization, right? Like finding an endpoint with no authentication, it's not that hard, right? There are tools that do that. We do that. Lots of things can do that, right? But things that will actually exercise your unique application logic and then try to manipulate and exploit and try, let's log in as Dan and then let's log in as Jason and try to access Dan's record. Like that's trickier. It is, but you can automate that even at that level. But it's not like, here, let me just run this off the shelf scanner and I'll get my result in 5 minutes. There's no SSL Labs equivalent of that. To get to that level of depth, there is plenty that will look for injections and that sort of thing and authentication weakness, but you got to go deeper than that because that's where the gnarly stuff is that's leading to the real serious breaches.
Yeah, it's I've been encouraged to see in the last few years that OWASP adopting the API top 10, and I think it's been helpful. One, to sort of illuminate that it is mostly the same stuff as all the other application exploits, but it all has a little bit different twist to it. So we've been really supportive and put together a style guide that can be used either in our platform or with the Spectral, the open source side, just to try to help catch those things as it's not much, to your point. It doesn't do anything for the application logic, but at least all the basics, the simple stuff that you would be really embarrassed if you got exploited with. We can at least help check that stuff.
Well, you're right. And they just came out with the new edition, the 2023 update. And the first version came out in 2019. So it's been around 4 years. And item 1 and 2 are unchanged, right? Like it's the same stuff. Item 1 is broken object level authorization. So that's kind of like the Coinbase scenario.
Yes.
Number 2 is broken auth, right? Like, okay, like for sure. That's a perfect application of Spectral and Stoplight. Like, have you defined what the authentication requirements are on every one of these endpoints? And there are tons of breaches that happen because of that, right? So it has the sort of primary breach vectors tend to still look the same, right? And so if you're tackling authorization and authentication, you're giving yourself a pretty good start on securing your APIs.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely plug for our OWASP top 10 style guide. It does a lot of good. Please use it, people. You don't even have to pay us. You just use the open source thing if you can't afford it. But it is easier if you pay a little something. You can just click the button. But
there you go.
Don't be embarrassed by these easy things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just to build on that, you're making me think of another example that kind of tells the story. So it's Peloton, where someone found their API wasn't really meant to be used in the wild, but they found it. And through the API, they could access pretty much all 4 million users' records, right? And including records that were marked private, right? So I'm a Peloton guy. If I would set my account as private, well, the API, had direct access to everything, right? So the issue number one was no authentication, 0, right? So like Spectral would have found that, Stoplight would have found that right off the bat. But when they got notified about the issue, they went and what did they do? They added authentication. All right. So great. Now you have to authenticate, and then you still have access to all 4 million records, right? So that's authorization. So they managed to hit both BOLA or OWASP number 1 and number 2 in that same episode. But it just goes to show like that stuff happens a lot, right? And so maybe that should be some of our sort of like core advice for organizations is really focus on that authentication and authorization, and you'll add a lot of security to your API.
Yeah, and certainly we're design time or design first ideologues a little bit, but I think I always try to point out to people like you don't have to wait until you've developed the API. Like if you're building your spec up front, you can find these things before you even start writing code. Like and it's again where like running a Spectral rule set or something that catches the fact that you have a dev that didn't even specify auth. Like there's no reason to let that even get past design time. It's just too.
That's right. And then have some sort of like, validation process that says, all right, we spect that this endpoint should have this level of auth. Does it actually have it? Right. And that's ripe for automation, right? There's no reason that can't be automated.
For sure. Well, we've already talked about kind of the APIsec University. Like I said, I checked it out. It seems pretty cool. And it's funny that you mentioned that some people are making it like a training requirement. I immediately started thinking like, maybe I should add this to our security training curriculum. It's interesting. But where else can folks kind of keep up with you and kind of continue to learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the question. So APIsecUniversity.com or APIsecu.com, if you want the shorter version, is a great place to go. We're actually posting a whole lot of good stuff into YouTube these days. So look for the APIsecu handle on YouTube. We do a lot of educational sessions that don't turn into courses. So like last week, we did a session on PCI. They've got a new DSS 4.0 requirement, and it's for the first time ever talks about APIs. So we talked to some really great experts. So check out our YouTube channel, Twitter, LinkedIn, of course. We have a very great community. In fact, if you sign up for our courses, we've got a Discord community where you can talk to other API experts. I think we got 8,000 people in there now. So a really healthy, vibrant community. So lots of ways to keep in touch. But like I say, this is not a business for us, right? This is we're putting all this content out there to help elevate security awareness, security expertise of the market. Our courses have tests and quizzes and exams. So we issue certificates and badges, which people put on their LinkedIn profiles all the time, which is really cool to see. And we're actually sort of following up on the OWASP, the new edition of OWASP. We got a new edition of our OWASP course. So it goes into every one of them in a lot of detail. So a lot of good content out there for folks to take advantage of.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing everything, and definitely go check it out, folks. Lots of good things to learn, and as we enumerated here, there's a lot of easy things to catch. It's maybe not as complicated as you're thinking. Well, thanks again, Dan. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.
API Intersection podcast listeners are invited to sign up for Stoplight and save up to $650. Use the code INTERSECTION10 to get 10% off a new subscription to Stoplight Platform Starter or Pro. Take a look at this episode's description for more details.